Welcome to this talk, which is going to be the first in a series of talks that Pip and I are going to be doing over the next few months. And the purpose of the talks is to look at the big topics in Christianity and explore our faith together, and hoping that as we do that, we can deepen our faith and deepen our knowledge and deepen our love of God. And we thought that we would begin at the beginning, and so today we're going to look at creation. And of course, creation asks probably the biggest of all questions: where do we come from? Why are we here? Who are we? And of course, this is a subject that is the subject of scientific inquiry. It's not just the domain of religion, it's both. But science and religion come at this question in different ways, and where science is interested in the mechanisms of creation, the how, if you like, religion is interested in the why of creation. Because from the point of view of faith, we make the assumption that the universe was brought into being by God. Someone made it, and they did it for a reason. And in sort of thinking about our own creation story and coming to understand it, it's really important that we remember that what Genesis is looking at is the why and not the how. We have a bit of a tendency to read the Bible, and perhaps the creation story more than any other bit of it, as if we're reading a newspaper or a scientific journal. But the Bible isn't like that. It's not meant to be an eyewitness account of creation. And if we read it like that, we just end up in a mess, because it doesn't answer the questions that only science can answer. But similarly, science can't tell us the theology of creation. We have to look to the Bible to understand the theology. Now, the writers of Genesis would have thought that we were very odd if they'd known that we were looking at their story like a newspaper, if we were treating it like an eyewitness account. They would have thought we were odd, and they would have thought that we were missing the point. Because Genesis is looking at why we are here, and it uses myth to do that. And it's really important to understand what the term myth means in this context. It's a technical term. It doesn't mean a fanciful made-up tale. A myth is a story that is told to convey truth. So the book of Genesis probably reached its final written form during the Babylonian exile, which was about 2,500 years ago, give or take. And at that time, Judaism was unusual, if not unique, among the religions of the ancient world, because it was monotheistic. The Jews insisted that there was only one God. And everybody else probably thought they were a bit weird for doing that, because, why would you hedge all your bets on one God when you can have lots of gods? Nevertheless, for the Jews, there was one God. He was all-powerful. He created the universe and everything in it, and he created human beings for a reason. And this view of creation was incredibly radical for its day. And the writers of Genesis wanted to show that. They wanted to give us a contrast between the true faith, the true monotheistic faith of Judaism as they saw it, and all these other pagan religions that were kicking around at the time. And in order to do that, they did something very clever. They drew on the creation stories of the ancient world. They took them and they changed them and adapted them to tell the story as they wanted to tell it. Call it plagiarism if you like, but that's what they did. Now, obviously, there were as many creation stories in the ancient world as there were religions, so how did they pick which ones they were going to use? Well, The two stories that will have had the greatest influence on the Hebrew scriptures are those from ancient Egypt and that from Babylon. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. The children of Israel spent quite a long time in Egypt. We read in the book of Exodus about their time there as slaves living in the land of Goshen in the Nile Delta. Later on in the history of Judaism, of course, we have the exile in Babylon. And that's a much shorter period of time, but a very intense period, a very important period psychologically in the Jewish consciousness. And so we have these two cultures greatly influencing Jewish thought. So let's take a look at their creation myths. Let's look at the myths of Egypt and Babylon and see what we can see in them, the similarities and the differences, and compare them to the story that Genesis gives us. So ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a culture that lasted for 3,000 years, give or take. And so it's not the case that it had one creation story that was kind of constant throughout the whole of the land and that remained constant over that time. There are a number of different stories that emerged. So what I'm going to give you is a bit of a kind of composite version of an Egyptian creation myth, and I do this with deep apologies for anyone who is an expert in Egyptology and will find my oversimplification offensive. But the stories begin, all of them begin, with the primordial waters of chaos. And one version of the story has 8 gods living in these waters, and they're 4 female gods and 4 male gods. They're paired, male and female. It's a very equal society at the beginning in ancient Egypt. And these gods represent, or the pairs of gods represent aspects of the primordial world. They represent darkness, infinity, water, and hiddenness. So from these primordial waters, the next thing that happens is that this pyramid-shaped rock emerges. It sort of rises up out of the water. And on that rock is God. And he is the god Atum, also known as Ra or Re. It's all the same person. Ra is the sun god, and he's the creator, or at least he's the creator of everything from that point on. Because obviously he didn't create the primordial waters because he was still kind of lurking somewhere in the depths waiting to come up on his little pyramid. And this is an important aspect of pagan religions, that there is a realm from which the gods come. There's a name for that. It's called the meta-divine realm, and it's an important thing in pagan religions because it gives a very neat explanation for the origin of evil. And Christianity doesn't have that, and it makes it much more difficult for us as Christians to come up with a good answer to the question of the problem of evil. So there's Ra, and Ra self-generates. I'll leave it to your imagination how he does that, 2 gods. And they are the gods of the wind, god called Shu, and of water, goddess called Tefnut. This is a male-female pairing thing again. Shu and Tefnut, in turn, have 2 children, one of whom is the god of the earth, he's called Geb, and the other one is the goddess of the sky, and her name is Nut. And Nut and Geb have 4 children, again in male-female pairs. Now, one of their children, a god called Seth, is an evil god, and Seth ends up murdering his brother, the god Osiris. And, again, this is a story of a male, of 2 brothers, one who murders the other one, and that should make us think about Cain and Abel. It's a very common motif in sort of creation stories from the ancient world, that we have this kind of sibling rivalry going on, and Egypt does it with Seth and Osiris. So the sky goddess and the earth god annoy their father, the wind god. And they annoy him so much that he says, right, I'm going to separate these 2. So it sort of moves them apart. And that's how we end up with Nut, the sky goddess, kind of draped over as the sky. Her body forms this dome. And on the ground underneath her lies Geb, the earth god. And this is an image that you will see, on the walls, well, the ceilings actually, of the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and in various other places in Egyptian monuments. You've got Nut, and then you've got Geb, and then there's a god in between. And the god in between is their dad, and he's trying to hold them apart. So sometime later, for reasons that we won't go into, Ra manages to lose one of his eyes. And he's a bit peeved about this. He's a bit upset. He wants it back. And he sends the other gods out to look for it. And two of them find it. And they try to bring it back to Ra. But the eye doesn't want to come. And it starts to cry. And from the tears of the eye of Ra come the first human beings. So there you are. We were created from tears, according to the ancient Egyptians. There is actually another version of that myth where the eye is so happy to see Ra that the tears are actually tears of joy. So you can have the sort of optimistic or pessimistic view of humans coming from tears. So time passes. Ra gets old. And in the eyes of the other gods and the various other humans that are around at this time, a bit past it. So they have a bit of rebellion. And Ra's a bit hacked off about this, so he decides to head off up to heaven and just kind of leave everyone down on earth to get on with whatever they want to get on with. But they don't want him to get up to heaven. The gods sort of try and, come up with him and try and sort of pull him back down again. And as Ra ascends, and these gods try to pull him back down, but these gods get dragged up to heaven with him. And thus were formed the stars. Later on in Egyptian mythology, humans are no longer formed from the tears of Ra. The eye eventually obviously stops crying. They are formed instead from clay, the clay of the Nile. And the god who does this is the Nile god, Khnum. And when you see depictions of Khnum again on the walls of temples in ancient Egypt, what you see is Khnum sitting at a potter's wheel, churning out children. And again, this is another symbol that's familiar to us because in the Old Testament we read of God as the potter and making us out of clay. St. Paul quotes this image of God and saying can not use the clay for whatever he likes in his epistles. So in ancient Egypt we have a story that begins with water and darkness. We have the creation of gods that symbolize the sun, the wind, the water, the earth, the sky, the stars. We have gods that are good and gods that are evil. We have humans created almost by accident from the tears of the disobedient eye of Ra. We have gods who are male and female. They get married, they have children. They get on each other's nerves. They annoy each other so much that sometimes they end up murdering each other. But there's nothing in this story about how humans relate to the gods. There's nothing about whether humans actually matter to the gods or not. And, in ancient Egypt, the belief was that you had to worship the gods in order to be treated well by them. And that failure to do that was likely to result in you not having a very good time. Your harvest would fail, or the Nile wouldn't flood, or you'd be infertile, or, all the various things that people would generally petition the gods to do for them. Before we leave ancient Egypt behind, there's one other Egyptian creation myth that is worth mentioning because it has echoes in our own creation myth. And it's one that comes from Memphis. That's Memphis, ancient Egypt, not Memphis, Tennessee, obviously. And this is from the cult of a god called Ptah. And Ptah's he's a kind of philosophical kind of guy. He's not cut from the same cloth as Ra and his somewhat wacky children. And Ptah brings the world into being through the power of speech. And obviously that immediately rings bells for us because this is how God creates in Genesis. let there be light, let the land bring forth plants, etc. Jesus, of course, the Word of God, through whom and for whom all things came into being. So that was Egypt. Let's look now at the Babylonian creation myth. And this is a lot more kind of Hollywood blockbuster genre. It's very violent, put it that way. And the story is known by the opening words in Babylonian. It's called the Enuma Elish. And Enuma Elish means something along the lines of when on high. And this story was composed somewhere around about 1800 BC. Again, there's a lot of disagreement about exactly when it dates from. So it's old. It's older than the Genesis story. But if you think about it, in 1800 BC, the Egyptians had been building pyramids and temples and stuff for around about 1,000 years. So, in terms of the history of humanity, it's not that old. So as with the Egyptian myth, we've got creation beginning in the primordial waters. But in Babylon, we've got salt water and fresh water mixing with each other in these waters. And these are identified with different goddesses and gods. We've got the goddess Tiamat in the salt water and the god Apsu in the fresh water. And Tiamat she's a fierce dragon. She's this monster. She's the goddess of disorder. And we think about fierce sea monsters, and that should remind you of Leviathan, the monster that appears in the book of Job, where God boasts that he can subdue all monsters. God has power over the monsters of the sea. That's a throwback to Tiamat. And Tiamat and Apsu have children. They give birth to lots and lots of gods and demons and so forth. And this is fine, but their children are very noisy. And Apsu gets a bit hacked off, because he can't sleep, and there's children around making a racket. And he talks to his kind of personal advisor chap, who says, you could do away with them, And he says, yeah, all right. And decides the way he's going to deal with his noisy children is to murder them. Tiamat's not very pleased. Makes suggestions about maybe just a bit more discipline. Might be a good idea. Now the children find out about Apsu's plan. And one of them, who's the earth god, murders Apsu. And at this point, Tiamat decides she's not going to side with her children anymore. She is mightily hacked off about this. And she decides that she's going to go to war against these gods. And Tiamat's a fairly formidable opponent, and the other gods are trying to sort of gather their forces and work out how they're going to defeat her. And various sort of mini-gods, say they're going to, go to battle with her, but they get within 100 yards and they actually know that's a really bad idea and they back off. And eventually the god Marduk is persuaded to take on Tiamat. Marduk is the great warrior. And Marduk says, yeah, okay, I will do this. But my price is that I want to be the kingpin, the top dog, the chief god. And I also want to be the person from here on responsible for creation. And, yeah, fine, Marduk, anything you like, whatever you like, no price is too high, just deal with Tiamat for us, please. And Marduk does this. He kills Tiamat. And what he does is he gets Tiamat's body, he gets her carcass, and you can imagine it a bit like a clamshell, and he sort of splits it apart so that the top bit of it forms the dome of the sky, and the bottom bit of it forms the land. There's a great deal of description in the Enuma Elish about how all the sort of rivers and seas and things flow out of Tiamat's carcass. It's really gruesome. And Marduk then goes on and does a bit of creation, and he makes celestial bodies, he makes the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the other gods come to him and they say, we've got to work all day or all night. The sun god's got to get up in the morning, he's got to go across the sky and go to bed at night, and the moon god's got to get up and across the sky at night. And it's really hard work being a god, Marduk, they say. Can you do something about it? Can you just make us some slaves to do the job for us so that we can just sit here and have a nice time? And Marduk and the earth god, the one who caused all the bother in the first place by killing Apsu, decide that we're going to do that. And what the earth god does is he takes the blood of Tiamat's general, who's also her son, and from that blood he creates, you've guessed it, human beings. In the Babylonian creation myth, human beings are created from the blood of the son of a sea monster. So it's a gruesome story, and it portrays the gods as violent and vengeful and lazy and cunning. And in that sense, the Enuma Elish kind of fits the Babylonian society, that sort of legitimization of hierarchy and monarchy and war and slavery. The world, as created by the Babylonian gods, is a morally bankrupt world where people seek to dominate each other. And if you think about the civilization of ancient Babylon, certainly if you think about it from the perspective of the Jews, they would say that the Babylonians were very much echoing the behavior of their gods. So that's Babylon. Let's look now at the Bible. Let's turn to our own creation story. Now, there are actually 3 creation stories in the Bible. There's 2 in Genesis and there's one in the book of Job, but we'll stay with Genesis. And the King James translation of the Bible opens thus. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the abyss. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. You can't beat the King James for a bit of poetry, can you? But you can sometimes beat it for accuracy of translation. And a more literal, if considerably less poetic, way of translating this would go something like this. At the beginning of God's creation, of the sky and the ground was without shape and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep water. And the wind of God was moving over the face of the water. There is disagreement over the grammar, over the correct translation of the opening sentences of Genesis. There's actually disagreement over the grammar and the correct translation of just about every other sentence in the Hebrew Bible, and that disagreement continues into the Greek of the New Testament. It's an ongoing problem with translation. Why does this matter? Because some scholars believe that when Genesis was written, its writers were deliberately alluding to the opening of Enuma Elish when they wrote their story. Why would they do that? Well, they would do it because they wanted to demonstrate the differences. They had this story of violence and gods behaving dreadfully and humans being made from blood, and it was just hideous. And they wanted to say, no, it's not like that. This is how it is. And we're going to take your story, your myth, and we're going to make it tell the truth. So we have the primordial waters in Genesis, just as in the Egyptian myth and just as in the Babylonian myth. But in Genesis, God just is. He doesn't come from anywhere. He doesn't emerge from the waters on a rock. He doesn't have parents. He just is. There's no meta-divine realm that gives rise to God in Genesis. And if God has no beginning, then logically he pre-exists creation. And the implication of this, although Genesis doesn't actually come out and say it, is that if God is before all things, then God logically must have created the universe from nothing. We have a wind moving over the surface of the waters in Genesis, as we had wind featuring in other stories. But this wind isn't a separate deity. It's the spirit or the breath of God. You know, with our Trinitarian understanding of the nature of God in Christianity, we do tend to speak of the Spirit of God moving over the surface of the waters, but we're sort of imposing Christianity onto the Hebrew writings of the Old Testament, and really a better translation would be the wind or the breath of God. And God brings creation into being by speech. His first words, of course, are, "Let there be light." And something to notice here is that God creates light on day one. And he creates the sun, the moon, and stars on day 4. Now, the writers of Genesis were not daft. They knew that the sun gives light. So why did they do it that way around? Well, there are a number of possible explanations for this, and, one of them is maybe that this is one of the things that reminds us that Genesis is myth. There's lots of things that happen in this story that don't follow scientific logic, because it's not science. Perhaps one of the most obvious ones a bit later on in the story is that suddenly we have a talking snake. Yeah? So, it's a myth. But the other message here is that in other religions of the ancient world, the sun, the moon, and the stars were gods. But God, for the Jews, was all-powerful and had no need of any assistance. There are no other gods, and he doesn't need other gods to bring forth light or indeed anything else. The sun and the moon are created objects, not divine beings, and the message of that is they are not to be worshipped. So the next thing God does after he's made light is he separates the waters below from the waters above. And this is kind of an odd image to us, but, the ancients believed that the sky was blue because it was a dome that held back waters that were above it. And, you think about it, the sea is full of water, and it's blue. The sky is blue, therefore it must have water behind it. It's perfectly logical. Perfectly wrong, but perfectly logical. So, this creation of the firmament of heaven, then, this is the act of the one God. It's not made from stretching Nut out across, making her body a dome. It's not made from splitting the carcass of Tiamat apart. One major issue with our creation myth, as I've alluded to earlier, is that Genesis doesn't give us any explanation for the origin of evil. And in some senses it does the opposite. Because at the end of each day of creation, God saw what he had made and he saw that it was good. And God makes human beings, he says it's very good. And, this was a problem that kept St. Augustine busy for years, because it's really hard to explain the origin of evil. If you're going to insist that there is one God, that he is love, and that creation is good. This is a difficult subject and something for us to discuss. So the final thing that God creates, of course, is us. He creates human beings. And we are told that God creates humans in his own image. Now, that does not mean that we look like God. Forget the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. What that means is that humans are created able to reflect the nature and glory of their Creator. Okay? The next thing God does is to give us dominion. He gives us dominion over creation. In other words, he gives us the responsibility to look after it. And of course, in recent times, this has been a bit of a topic of discussion because it's very obvious that we have fallen somewhat short of expectations. Well, maybe not. I suppose God would have known exactly what we were going to do, but we've certainly not done very well in our stewardship of creation. And I've said that God comments that humans are, on the end of the day of creation, when he makes human beings, that it is very good. And this contrast between God's comments at the end of days 1 to 5 and then his comment at the end of day 6 is really there to show the importance of human beings in creation, their specialness, their special relationship with God, their ability to reflect his glory, his nature. Now, of course, we have a second creation story in Genesis which sort of blends with the first one. It kind of follows on from it, and it gives us another account of how human beings came to be. And, of course, everything in creation to this point has been brought into being by God speaking. But to make Adam, God picks up dust from the ground, dust or clay, and he breathes into Adam. The Bible says he breathes into Adam's nostrils. Now, the name Adam isn't actually a proper name at all. It just means man made of earth. Earthman. It's just ancient Hebrew. And this fact that we're not just made from clay like Canaan making children out of the clay of the Nile. We're made and God breathes into us. And this is another way of setting humans apart in creation, demonstrating the specialness of their relationship with God. So God then does a series of things for Adam. He plants him a garden. He quite literally makes paradise for him. He then worries because Adam is alone. And he makes all those animals, and you have that thing where Adam has to think of lots of names for everything. Adam's still lonely. So God makes Eve. And if you think about it, Adam hasn't done anything to deserve any of this. He's not built an altar, he's not made sacrifices, he's not constructed a giant temple out of the cedars of Lebanon. All Adam has done is exist. And God has given him everything he could possibly want. And again, this is a very radical feature of Genesis' account of the creation. Because what that tells us is that we can't earn God's favour. We can't bargain with God. And this was a very common feature in the ancient world. You offered sacrifices to the deity of your choice in order to basically bribe them to do what you wanted them to do for you. Or stop them from doing what they might otherwise have done. But God's actions in Genesis are entirely free. His action of creation is free. Everything he does for Adam is just out of love. And this is obviously quite a contrast to all our other creation stories. And, we don't necessarily see how radical that story was or how radical it would have seemed in the ancient world because it's the one we're used to. But thinking about our creation myth, one of the questions that we have to answer is our creation story true? What do we say to people when they ask us whether we believe that God actually created the world in 6 days? Actually, they usually say 7 days because they haven't read the story properly and they forget that God rested on the 7th day, but there's no point going down that. We just let that one stick to the wall. Well, what we can say is that our creation story, our creation myth, does what myths are supposed to do, which is to teach us fundamental truths. The opening of Genesis teaches us about who God is, why he created us, what he's like, and perhaps most importantly of all, what our relationship is to him, or should be. The Genesis myth makes all these astonishing claims. that there is one God, not lots of gods, and there is nothing in heaven or earth that should be worshipped other than God. God has no gender. He's not male or female. Now, this is obviously a bit difficult because English kind of compels us to use gendered pronouns, and so, we struggle a bit with this one, but it's really important to remember God is not male or female. He's not a created being. He's God. God has always existed. He made everything in heaven and earth. God alone is divine. Perhaps the most significant truth that we learn from Genesis, though, is that God cares about us. He made us because he loves us. We weren't made by accident from a God's tears, and we certainly weren't made from the blood of the son of a sea monster. We were made by a God who brought us into being because he loves us. We don't have to do anything to attract his attention or earn his love, because we already have both of those things. Yes, we rebelled against him. Yes, we did lots of stuff that caused a whole load of hassle. Yes, God had to come down in person and try and sort it all out and set us all back on the right track again. But in the end, we were created in God's image and likeness, capable of reflecting his glory, capable of knowing him, and capable of loving him. So, I think it's pretty obvious from the Genesis story that God took a bit of a risk when he created human beings in the way that he did, with kind of no conditions attached, just created us because he loved us. But God knew that he was taking a risk. He knew exactly what he was getting into, and he knew exactly how much bother we were going to cause him, long before he uttered the fateful words, "Let there be light." But the amazing thing about God is that knowing all of that, he went ahead and he created us anyway.